Watch In-Depth Fiction Edition next month when author Brad Meltzer will be our guest on Book TV on C-SPAN 2.
Now, a debate from the Connecticut governor's race between Republican Bob Stefanowski, Democrat Ned Lamont, and independent candidate Oz Griebel. They're running to succeed Democratic Governor Dan Malloy, who decided not to seek re-election. Real Clear Politics has the race listed as a toss-up. This is just under an hour.
And good evening from Foxwoods Resort Casino Convention Center. I'm Ann Nyberg. Our panelists asking the questions this evening from left to right are News 8 anchorman Keith Kuntz, Hartford Courant reporter Daniela Altamari, and Joe DeLong, Executive Director of the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities. We're going to start tonight's debate in just a moment, but first we're going to go over some guidelines. For each question, the candidate who is asked the question will get 1 minute to respond. That will be followed by a 90-second rebuttal from the two other candidates. And then the candidate who was asked the initial question will be allowed a 30-second response. Before we get started with the candidates, each candidate will have a 1-minute opening statement. The order was selected randomly, and we begin with petitioning candidate Mr. Oz Griebel. 1 minute.
Thanks, Ann. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. Monty Frank and I have been labeled as the spoiler in this race, and I'll spend some time tonight in answering questions addressing that on a frontal basis, as well as the concept of wasted votes. As you listen to the answers tonight, I hope you come to the conclusion on two major facts. One is the spoilers in this race are the two major party candidates that are looking to sustain the last 30 years of no net job growth, increases in taxes and fees, higher rates in those areas, underinvestment in transportation and education, and taking care of the agencies that serve the most vulnerable around us, and the outmigration of people of all ages and all income levels. The option that Monty Frank and I offer you is to elect a ticket that is focused not on sustaining the parties, but on focusing on you as Connecticut taxpayers, residents, and employers. So we'll look to earn your vote tonight on November 6th.
Mr. Griebel, thank you very much. Mr. Lamont.
Well, good evening, CCM, and it's great to be back east of the river. Let me start where I started this campaign. You need a governor who's going to be absolutely fearless when it comes to shaking up Hartford and taking on the entrenched interests. And that's what I have done my entire life. I took on a senior member of my own party when I thought he was wrong on the war in Iraq. And I did take on Dan Malloy 8 years ago because I thought I had a better plan to get Connecticut moving again. And now, having run against two Democrats, actually it's my opportunity to run against two Republicans, a more traditional Republican in Oz until recently, and Bob, more of a Trump Republican. Truth be told, a lot of talk about politicians. I'm the one guy up here who's actually started a business and created jobs. We're going to jumpstart this economy, make sure it's a fair economy where we protect Obamacare and fight for Connecticut values, not Trump values, Connecticut values. I hope to earn your vote and your trust.
Thank you so much. Mr. Stefanowski.
Thank you, Ann. You know, I honestly think that all three candidates tonight truly do want to invest in health care, improve education, and keep our families safe. The difference is in how we plan to get there. Dan Malloy instituted the two largest tax increases in the history of Connecticut. Has that helped our economy? Absolutely not. And somehow Oz and Ned thinks if we do more of the same, if we put just one more tax on, or we put up tolls, we're going to get a different answer. Just last week, Ned's now suggesting a payroll tax for businesses in Connecticut. Ladies and gentlemen, after 8 years of this, enough is enough. We need to cut costs. We need to reduce the size of government. We need to get this economy moving. We can use an improving economy and growth to invest in education and health care and revitalize our cities. The choice you have in 7 days is more of the same, another 4 years of Dan Malloy, or a change that's going to get this economy moving and get the state of Connecticut finally, after 8 years, finally turned around. Thank you.
Stefanowski. The first question of the night will go to Mr. Oz Griebel, and it comes from Keith Coots. Keith.
Ann, thank you very much, sir. Good evening.
Good evening.
I want to begin by turning our attention to the state's larger cities, where in many cases we see higher levels of unemployment and fewer job opportunities than our more affluent communities. What is your detailed plan to bring greater vitality to our state's major cities in a time of budget constraints?
60 seconds.
First of all, I would point out, I think we've got two very vibrant smaller cities in this state, Keith, and Stamford and New Haven, and what Yale has done in New Haven to really resurrect that city on a number of areas where they've made a major leadership push in the city to bring retail and residents into the city. That's a very dynamic small city. So sometimes I think we don't give ourselves enough credit for what's going on in the state. Clearly, you have major challenges in Hartford and Bridgeport that are of a different size than some of our smaller cities. The thing we have to do, and I've used Hartford as the example, is in the case of Hartford, is get that mill rate down to now it's 75 down to 50. So as examples of that, how to do it, would include taking the state-owned office buildings today and put those into sale-leaseback agreements where those buildings would come back on the commercial rolls. We have to have serious discussions in all the cities with the other holders of tax-exempt property. The notion of some of our hospitals and higher eds that provides huge, important services still are using the police and fire and emergency services. We've got to have those conversations so that we'll attract private sector investment into those cities.
Thank you so much. Mr. Lamont, 90 seconds.
Well, Keith, I appreciate your question about the cities. I'd also like to say we're a small state. So the small towns, our rural areas, as well as our cities, we're in this together. And we're never going to be great unless our cities are great. And one way to make sure that our cities and small towns have a hard time surviving is if you eliminate over 60% of our budget. If you eliminate $11 billion out of our budget, as Bob Stefanowski has proposed. Because you know who's going to end up paying for that? You do. Your mayors and first selectmen. It's your towns. It's your cities. It will jack up property taxes. It will hit and crush education. It's the exact wrong thing to do, Keith, if you want to help our small towns as well as our major cities. We have to have great, vibrant cities. Vibrant cities are so key to keeping young people here, attracting jobs, and protecting our rural space outside. You know, Oz said it's very important. We have to expand the grand list of our cities. We have to attract business into our cities. Right now, the highest property tax, the highest tax areas are in our cities. That's driving business and young people out of them. It's the exact wrong thing to do. What I would do is, A, make sure we keep our commitment to our schools, make sure we have great K-12 education in our cities, make sure young families want to be attracted there. That will attract the small business, grow the grand list, and do everything I can to make sure that each and every one of us know we're in this together.
Thank you very much. Mr. Stefanowski, 90 seconds.
Thank you, Ann. I can remember, I think it was July or August, I went to the Puerto Rico Day Parade in Bridgeport. And I had people running up to me saying that the first time in their life, they were lifelong Democrats. For the first time in their life, they're going to vote Republican. And you know why they were saying that? Because they want change. They want economic growth. They want a vibrant city. And they know that under Ned and Oz, it's going to be more of the same. When I explained to them that we're going to cut the corporate tax rate, and that's going to get companies to come back to Connecticut. When I explained to them that we're going to invest more in education, in trade schools, in businesses. And when I explained to them that, yes, over 8 years, we'll gradually eliminate that state income tax, and the people that are working will have more take-home pay to invest in education. They said, thank goodness somebody finally has some common sense. When I told them that we weren't going to raid the Special Transportation Fund anymore, we were going to actually use that money to improve the train times and fix our roads and bridges. We can go on forever and ever about what to do to fix the cities, but the best way to fix this entire state is economic growth. And by the largest tax increases in the history of man over the last 8 years, and some of the worst governing by Dan Malloy, we've stunted the economic growth. It's time to bring it back. It's time for a new plan. It's not time for more of the same. That's going to get these big cities growing.
Thank you so much. Mr. Griebel, 30 seconds.
Monty and I have said that every decision we make will be viewed through the primary criteria of whether it enhances Connecticut's ability to add 200,000 net new private sector jobs over the next 10 years. We can argue that's not ambitious or too ambitious, but it beats the pants off of no net job growth in 30 years. Our biggest asset is our proximity to Boston and New York. And our ability to recruit companies and individuals out of there has to be part of the major driver of restoring our city's employment opportunities in the city, increasing the grand list, and attracting greater private sector investment.
All right, thank you so much. Question number 2 from Daniela Altamari to Mr. Ned Lamont.
Imagine you're governor. You're confronted with the reality of closing a college campus, sharply cutting services to people with disabilities, or drastically curtailing municipal aid. To prevent those outcomes, would you raise taxes on the state's wealthiest residents? And if not, how would you resolve the state's financial crisis without destroying Connecticut's quality of life? Please be specific. Your answer cannot include finding efficiencies, anticipating growth, declaring a state of emergency, or eliminating fraud and abuse.
In 60 seconds, Mr. Lamont.
All right, you asked the question, you answered it. Well, first thing you do is when you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. And we've got a $2.5 billion deficit, Danielle, that we're inheriting, and I'm going to have to fix that. And I can't do that by making empty promises to eliminate another $8, $10, $12 billion out of this budget. What I can do is tell you we're going to hold the line on the income tax. I'm not going to raise the income tax. I can tell you I will reduce the property tax just enough to let your people know that we're making an effort to hold the line there. Let seniors know that this is a place where they can afford to stay. Let young families know this is a place they can grow and come back. And I'm going to be ruthless when it comes to looking at our health care expenses, looking at pension reform, looking at the big ticket items that allow us to get this state going again. I've got to give you confidence that we're going to have an honestly balanced budget for the first time in a generation, a budget that doesn't borrow from the future, but invest in the future, invest in education, invest in transportation. That's how we get this state growing again.
Thank you. Mr. Stefanowski, 90 seconds.
I would say there's a couple of buckets here. I think one is privatization. Look at the Department of Motor Vehicles. They spent $25 million on their computer systems 2 years ago. Anybody getting faster service in the DMV these days? I'm certainly not. What does Ned wants to do? He wants to go in and spend another $20 million to try it again. There's $20 million right off the top. Let's take the good employees from the DMV. Let's bring in the private sector. Let's run it like a business for a profit. Number 2, let's look at the $10 million that Dan Molloy wants to spend on a toll study that we've already voted down. They throw these numbers around like they're immaterial. 10 million here, 20 million here. It starts to add up. Let's look at the busway from New Britain to Hartford. $600 million for a 9-mile bus route, $1,000 per inch. The problem with the people in Hartford is they view it as their money. It's your money. It's your taxpayer money. It's the money that you could be using to invest in education and to take care of your family. We have to get spending under control. When, and I say when we get spending under control, we can start to reduce that tax rate, and that'll bring businesses back, and that'll create more disposable income, and people will go out and buy more goods and services. And that'll create a virtuous cycle of a growing economy that'll provide higher tax revenues versus the death spiral that we're in right now under the Molloy administration, and that these guys want to continue.
Thank you so much. Mr. Griebel, 90 seconds.
Daniela, neither of those responses answered the very serious problem we're facing as of July 1st, a $4.6 billion operating deficit on roughly a $40.4 billion 2-year budget. You take out the 40% that'll be on July 1st at 12:01 a.m. that's already allocated to debt service, to state retiree contributions and state retiree health care, you're down to something close to 27 or 28 billion. This is a serious matter that doesn't lend itself to poll-tested platitudes. These are the things that need to be looked at hard and need to engage people like you in this. So 2 things we've said from the outset. We would use the rainy day fund. If this isn't raining now financially, I don't know what rain looks like. So that $2 billion that's projected to be there as of June 30th, we would bring that in over the 2 years. And begin to reduce that deficit. We would look at at deferring payments to the teacher retirement fund and to the state employee retirement fund for 2 years. I know it's counterintuitive to the $80 billion problem, but tell me how else you're going to balance that budget. You either have to raise taxes, which we do not want to do because that will send the worst signal to the private sector, to you as residents, to you as municipal leaders, and to employers. On the other hand, you can't cut $4.6 billion out of this deficit. We have no option to lay off any state employees for 2 years. I'm not advocating layoffs, but that's the agreement we have. So we need to buy time in this 2-year budget to give us some breathing room so we don't raise taxes and we don't cut services in a draconian manner.
All right, thank you so much. Mr. Lamont, rebuttal, 30 seconds.
I think when Oz says take money from the rainy day fund, we're just kicking the can down the road, just like John Rowland and Jody Rell did. And by the way, it's illegal not to make contributions to the teacher pension fund under the bond covenant. That's just wrong. I think Bob has also talked about not dealing with this fiscal crisis head on. I'm the one person who's going to solve this. It's not a $4.6 billion deficit. It's 2.5, and it's just 2.5 if I solve it on a recurring basis in year one. And that's what I mean to do, so you know what your budget is going to be and you can count on it.
All right, thank you so much. Question number 3, Joe DeLong. This goes to Mr. Stefanowski.
Thank you, Ann. Mr. Stefanowski, we've heard a lot throughout this campaign about the income tax. However, according to the nonprofit Lincoln Institute for Land Policy, Connecticut towns and cities are more dependent on the property tax than any other state. What are your plans to address municipalities' over-reliance on the property tax? And are you supportive of efforts to allow cities and towns to directly diversify their revenue streams in order to curb property tax over-reliance?
And I'll tell you, as part of governor, you travel all across the state. Most of the towns that I've been to manage their finances infinitely better, and I know this will be popular in this room, infinitely better than what happens in Hartford. The problem is the mandates. There's over 1,300 mandates, and many of those are unfunded. How do you run a town or a city when you can't pretend to plan ahead for more than a year? Dan Malloy, mid-year, comes in and cuts education funding. After agreeing to a number at the beginning of the year, he cuts it. So as governor, one of the things I'll require is any unfunded mandate, I will veto. Veto. I'll ask all of my department heads to go look at all the mandates out there right now and start to eliminate them. But the best way to help property taxes is to get property values up. Oz is bragging about a 53 mill rate in Hartford. Any city with a mill rate of over 40 to 50 is essentially bankrupt. I was endorsed by the Connecticut Realtors Association, 17,000 realtors. They met with all 3 of us. We did a debate. They like my plan to get property values up, and that's going to raise property taxes and get the cities moving again.
All right, thank you so much. Mr. Griebel, 90 seconds.
Thank you, Ann. On the income tax, Joe, I just want to be clear. I am a believer in the personal income tax. I believe it's the workhorse tax of the state. It generates about $10.5 billion. We would like to get rates down over time. Absolutely. 200,000 more people working in this state over 10 years will allow that to happen. But it is the least regressive of all taxes. None of us want to be taxed. Don't tax me, don't tax you, don't tax me, tax the person behind the tree. None of us want to pay taxes. But it is the least regressive, Joe. And the most important thing on the property tax side is to make sure we don't lower the income tax so those taxes get transferred into the municipality. There's no free lunch here. The second thing I would say is touching the third rail of looking at regional delivery of municipal services to get at putting the property tax down. I am not a fan, to answer your question directly, of giving municipalities an additional taxing authority. I think it will send the wrong signal to the private sector, residents and employers. So we definitely would want to make sure, as I said a second ago, looking towards using the COGS as a way of getting regional delivery of municipal services and all the third rails of public safety and education. But if we're not prepared to have that kind of a discussion, there is no way we're going to drive those mill rates down and support that. We've had cuts to municipal aid now for 4 or 5 budget cycles. That's the kind of thing that is going to be with us for a while. We've got to look at a regional approach to the delivery of municipal services rather than taxing.
Thank you so much. Mr. Lamont, 90 seconds.
Yeah, Joe, I appreciate your question. We over-rely on the property tax. It's a regressive tax. It's a tough tax. It's a tax that hits the middle class, which is why it's the tax I say I am going to reduce in the first budget cycle and the second budget cycle. $300 in the first cycle, $1,500 for middle-class folks in the second cycle. If, as you imply, you eliminate the income tax and the corporate income tax, and you take $10, $12 billion out of that budget, each and every one of your towns is going to be making up that difference. They're just pushing those costs onto you. And that's the exact wrong thing to do. You want to make sure, A, we continue to fund education, so we have the best schools in our cities as well as our towns. So young people want to keep moving into our towns and cities, and that's how we keep our workforce here. And number two, transportation. You want to make sure that you make our towns and cities transportation hubs where rail can come and go from that hub with affordable housing in and around it. That's how we do it. That's how we start expanding the grand list. That's how we start attracting businesses back into our cities. Look, the first guy who's actually started a business and created jobs, that's what you need to do. The Fiscal Commission was very clear. They said, first off, fiscal stability and economic growth. This would be just dysfunctional to get rid of the income tax. That would be fiscal instability. That would drive economic growth into the ground. It's the wrong thing to do. We got to do everything we can to build up our towns, build up our cities, and hold down the property tax.
All right, thank you so much. 30 seconds, Mr. Stefanowski.
You know, so Ned just said he doesn't want to reduce the state income tax. He's on tape saying he's going to introduce a statewide auto tax. You know what that's going to do? It's going to pull revenue out of the cities. It's going to send it up to Harvard. Do you think you're ever going to see that revenue again? Of course not. All the discussion about taxes, we need to get it down. We've had 8 years of increasing taxes. Enough is enough. We are never going to get out of this problem that we're in by cuts, cuts, cuts. We've got to grow our way out. If the state of Connecticut had just grown at the same rate as the national economy over the last 6 years, we'd have $12 billion more of revenue right now.
All right, thank you, sir. I appreciate that. Question number 4, Keith Koontz. This goes to Mr. Griebel.
Sir, a majority of states in the nation now allow for some form of early voting, but Connecticut does not. As governor, would you support measures that would allow for some form of early voting with the idea of increasing participation?
I certainly would look at it, Keith. I think the issue of people registering and participating in this process, in the voting process, is absolutely critical. I certainly have voted in every election that I've had an opportunity to do. We've encouraged family members to make sure they're registered. The early voting would be something I would look at. One of the things that's much more appealing to me, and I don't know whether this would be a national thing, why do we vote on Tuesdays? Why isn't it a vote on a weekend or Saturday or Sunday? I think there ought to be other ways to look at how we make it easier for people to participate in an appropriate manner. But clearly, the notion of being participating in this very important democratic process is key. And so, yes, I would look at that, but I think there are other things we would look at to make sure that there is more participation. We're looking at 30 and 40% participation, as we do right now on a national average. It's deplorable when we look at how important these votes are. So I would look at those things. I'd also look at things, making sure that you've got appropriate social studies focus on civic engagement, which I think you have to start inculcating this early on. So to me, it's not just slicing off one aspect of this. It's how do you deal with the whole issue to make sure that younger people are engaged, that we're making it appropriately easier for people to vote, but that they understand the importance of that responsibility.
Thank you so much. Mr. Lamont, 90 seconds.
Well, the nuttiest thing is having primaries in August when it's so tough to get more and more people to vote. And I want people to vote. I want them to have a stake in this election. I want them to know it makes a difference. And one of the things I do is I campaign nonstop to each and every one of your 169 towns, is I got to convince people it makes a difference. I got to convince people in the cities that say, oh, it hasn't made that. It's made a big difference. We have tens of thousands of fewer people behind bars. It's made a difference. These people are having a second chance. These elections make a difference. We have many more units of affordable housing in the last 7 years. Look what happened 2 years ago in Washington, D.C. If the election of Donald Trump doesn't remind you, elections make a difference. And I've got to convince everybody that this is an election that is lights on, lights off in terms of where we take this state. Not only in terms of how do we build up our towns and cities, how do we build up education, transportation. I'm going to working hand in glove with the business community to make sure they know they're going to have an honestly balanced budget that they can count on. Elections make a difference. And I've got to get this negative tone out of the body politic right now. I think we've got to give people something to believe in. I can't stand everybody knocking the state of Connecticut. That discourages people from voting. I got to tell you, elections make a difference. This election makes a difference. I believe in the state of Connecticut. And if you vote, we're going to turn this around.
So, sir, would you support measures that support early voting?
Yes, I would.
Okay.
All right. Thank you. Mr. Stefanowski, 90 seconds.
Yeah, I think early voting, properly verified, makes a ton of sense. Anything we can do to increase the participation rate would be good. But I also think what voters are looking for is an exciting choice. I think a lot of the reason people have stayed home is more of the rhetoric, more of the political speak, People are ready for a change right now. I get the sense people are going to come roaring back to the polls next week. They want change. They're tired of what's going on in this economy. I do think it's a short time period between the primary and the general. Not that I want to do this for another 6 years, but having a primary in August where a lot of people are out on vacation and then rolling right to a general, maybe give a little bit more time. But anything we can do to get the participation rate up. I would argue this is one of the most important elections in Connecticut history. If we don't vote for change, and if we keep the status quo with Dan Malloy, it's not too late to fix this state. It is absolutely not too late, but it's pretty darn close. And if we don't start to fundamentally reform our tax policy and cut the size of government and get this economy moving and get our people to want to stay here, it might be too late in 4 years.
All right, thank you so much. Mr. Griebel, 30 seconds.
Well, I'm glad, Bob, that feels strongly about voting, given his track record. So I'm glad that all three of us up here feel that voting is important. Let me just say the most important thing about this election is breaking up the duopoly. That's what Monty Frank and I offer. What takes the electorate prisoner is not having, the electorate gets them discouraged, is not having honest discussions about a lot of our issues. That's what this ticket offers, and that's why we want to make sure that we earn your vote on November 5th to break up the power of this duopoly.
All right, thank you so much. Question number 5, Daniela Altamari to Mr. Lamont.
The national issue of mistrust of police, particularly in communities of color, has reared its head in Connecticut in multiple examples. Most recently, a Hartford police officer told a group of people, the majority of whom were Black and Latino, that he was, quote, a little trigger happy. As governor, what steps would you take to improve police community relations and to make sure African American citizens feel safe?
60 seconds.
Well, I see Neil O'Leary, the mayor of Waterbury, a former police chief, now a mayor, and I love what he did in terms of the Police Athletic League, where the kids get to know the cops, they do sports, they get to know each other. 15 years later, that kid's growing up and the cop sees him doing something that maybe he shouldn't be doing, say, hey, we know each other, what are you doing? I mean, that is the type of community policing and trust that you have to build in each and every one of our towns. I also say we got to do a lot better job of protecting our people. And that's what reminded me just a few days ago when you saw the massacre in the synagogue. And you saw that was committed by the same type of gun that killed our kids at Sandy Hook, the same AR-15. And by the way, also at the synagogue, there were 4 policemen from a SWAT team that were shot down as well as part of that. We've got to do everything we can in terms of protecting our real serious gun laws coming after Sandy Hook. Bob has talked about taking them back, revoking them. That's the exact wrong thing to do.
All right,
and I'm going to do everything I can to fight for their safety.
Mr. Stefanowski, 90 seconds.
Yeah, I think when it comes to safety and police, we absolutely need to protect the people in our cities, particularly in the schools. I mean, I've got 3 daughters. What happened in Sandy Hook is an absolute tragedy. But as Ned likes to do, to focus just on guns as the sole problem, it's not the sole problem. We need to start limiting access to schools. We need to keep guns out of the hands that people should not have them. It's largely a mental health issue. Unfortunately, we're probably at the point where we need trained, not teachers, but we probably up to the different towns, trained personnel in schools to protect our kids. In terms of police-community relationships, I agree, the more collaboration we can have, the more activities we can have together, I think it makes it better. But number 1 comes security. I also don't think the early release program by Dan Malloy is helping. I really don't. 50% of the people that are released under that program end up back in jail. The mass murder in Griswold was happened by somebody who was released out of prison early. I could go on with examples for hours. The drug overdoses on the New Haven Green, somebody that was arrested 37 times. So this is a very serious issue. We need to look at it hard. First and foremost needs to be the safety of our citizens and our children and having the proper controls around these things.
Thank you so much, Mr. Griebel. 90 seconds. Yes, 90 seconds.
90 seconds. A couple of things, Daniela. One is certain pride, the community policing effort, sitting down with the police chiefs in the state, understanding from their perspective, what their needs are, talking with the community groups, the leaders in those community groups, finding those ways to build bridges, using organizations like ACLU, taking advantage of projects, things like Project Longevity to try to reduce some of the violence in the cities. The thing that, though, to me, a governor's got the most important responsibility for, and that's to set the tenor in this state. the tenor that says there's bone-deep respect for every individual, that there's a sense of tolerance, a sense of civility, a sense of being willing to listen and have the genuine debate and not paint people into corners because of their skin color or their religion or their particular political persuasion. That may sound like trite, but to me, setting the example for the rest of the state is critical as we get to some of these very serious racial issues, these acts of violence, the hate crimes that are there. It's more than just the guns. The guns are important, and making sure Lonnie Frank has worked on this for many years, making sure that the laws that are in place today stay in place. But it's addressing the entire issue, education, and making sure that we do everything we can that a child does read at grade level by third grade to reduce the likelihood of incarceration. It's taking the Second Chance program and making sure that when people come back to the cities, back to their hometowns, they have a chance to gain employment and reduce the level of recidivism. There are serious issues that are embedded in this, and while the guns themselves are important, it is the whole tenor of the way we treat one another across the board. And it's a major leadership responsibility for a governor.
All right, thank you so much. And 30 seconds to you, Mr. Lamont.
It's not either or. You need a leader who does change the tenor, treats people with civility, and stops this divisive rhetoric that is being used. I mean, it's incredible what's permitted in this day and age in terms of racial and anti-Semitic type language. But guns do matter. AR-15s on our street matter. Bob got an A rating from the NRA. I don't know what he promised him, but I know it involves revoking the basic protections we had after Sandy Hook. That is key to a state like ours. It's key nationwide. I'm going to make sure we're a leader when it comes to reasonable gun safety rules.
All right, thank you so much, gentlemen. We're going to take a 2-minute break now and come back with more questioning for the candidates. You're watching live coverage of the Connecticut gubernatorial debate on News 8. And welcome back to News 8's live coverage of the final gubernatorial debate, live from Foxwoods Resort and Casino. Let's get right back to the candidates with a question from CCM Executive Director Joe DeLong. Joe.
Thank you, Ann. And gentlemen, specifically first, Mr. Stefanowski, special education costs are one area of local education budgets that are often unpredictable and very difficult to control. What proposals will you help initiate to help mitigate the rising cost of providing special education services for school districts? And do you have any specific proposals to expand regionalization initiatives for the delivery of special education services?
Mr. Stefanowski, 60 seconds.
Yeah, I think first and foremost is to take care of the kids that need it and make sure that they're getting the services that they deserve and the services that they need. That's the number one priority. It trumps everything else. You do need to be cognizant of cost, but it should in no way impact the needs that these kids have. I'm against regionalization. I think the best people to make this decision are the local school boards and the parents, and to take it on a case-by-case basis and figure out the best way to handle these things. I do think we should look at the concept of the money following the student, so that if a student does move mid-year and the cost to take care of that student is in one town, that if he or she moves to another town, the cost and the reimbursement travels with them to make sure that they continue to get the care that they need. But it's a big priority. We need to figure out a way to take care of the kids that need it. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Mr. Griebel, 90 seconds.
Thank you, Joe. It is a challenging issue that I don't necessarily have a straight ABC answer to you for, but I go back to something that says we've got a lot of agencies in this state that take care of some of the most challenged individuals physically and mentally and provide those incredibly important services. So working with those agencies, as well as with the school districts, to me it has to be part of this issue as we try to move people back into a mainstream situation. The notion that we're providing services to those to individuals with special needs, so we're moving them into the mainstream, we're giving them job opportunities down the road. It's not just the cost, Joe, that I want to say is what is the long-term strategy to making sure that people with special needs are given the most opportunities to contribute to society, to see that they have the sense of self-worth that comes with the respect that we show them, and that gets embedded into the things like how we're going to pay for it. The issue that, at least as I talk to folks, Joe, come back to the notion of how do we make sure that the dollars we spend and tax dollars we spend for education are going into the classroom and are closer to the students across the board. That's why I am in favor of taking a hard look at how we can develop regional delivery of key services, including education and including the special education component of overall public education.
All right, thank you. Mr. Lamont, 90 seconds.
Yeah, I think the state does have to take more of a lead when it comes to folks with special needs, and how expensive that can be for each and every one of our towns, and the idea of people shopping from town to town. We need some statewide standards. We need some ways that we can do a better job of funding that. But it is fundamental to what our government does. We do take care of the most vulnerable. And I was just reminded, I was meeting with some folks at HARC the other day, and some of the amazing not-for-profits that work with their heart, with incredible heart for these folks, and giving them a chance, and giving their parents an opportunity to keep working, and how important this is. And one of the things they just reminded me, when the people talk about how easy it is to rip $1 billion out of the budget, there's about 2,000 people waiting, 2,000 folks with intellectual disabilities waiting to get into a group home. And I saw their parents in their 60s, parents in their 70s, saying, I'm just worried that nobody's going to be there to take care of my child when I'm no longer able to do it. These are the type of roles that government has to play in close consultation with the not-for-profits, working with our teachers in education. I'll say something else. We got to work with these kids a lot earlier. Before we say, oh my gosh, they're a kid with disabilities and special needs, we get there earlier, we give them a better opportunity, we can make a big difference in their lives, hold down costs, and give them the best opportunity. That's what I mean to try and do.
Thank you so much. Mr. Stefanowski, 30 seconds.
Yeah, again, I think you had to be careful about Hartford trying to manage from Hartford. To me, the parents should have the input. The local school board should have the input. There should be some oversight that each town and city has adequate resources to provide this. I do think, by the way, a growing economy is the best way to provide more services and more money to fund all of these critical programs. But it really comes down to the individual decision of the parent and the school board as to what's best.
All right, thank you so much. Keith, your question will go to Mr. Griebel.
Okay, thank you very much, Ann. All of you have been extremely successful in your professional lives, but I would like to know what personal sacrifices you have made to help the less fortunate members of our society.
60 seconds, Mr. Griebel.
Certainly, like many people, I've contributed to organizations financially to do that. I've volunteered in organizations that deal with, particularly in the urban areas, on reading programs. I think it's a little bit of a dodge, Keith, but the most important thing I think I've done is work with organizations, United Ways, other organizations in the urban areas that deal, particularly in the urban areas, that deal with people who are less fortunate than others. It's trying to get collaboration across the board. That's where I think my leadership skills have come in. But I've certainly contributed, as I said a second ago, both financially and with time to organizations that support folks that provide things like literacy skills and the like. That's a big part. Worked with junior achievement and taught classes in those areas. So to me, it is about providing opportunities for people. And as I said a second ago, finding ways that you're bringing agencies together that are responsible for that, making sure that they're funded properly, that they're supported with appropriate dollars from the private sector, and making sure that we're taking advantage of eliminating, as I said a few minutes ago, making sure that the money that is going into those organizations are going to the people that need it and not going into administrative overhead. So that's where I've spent most of my time in trying to deal with some of the issues that are embedded in your question.
Mr. Lamont, 90 seconds.
Well, Keith, I was blessed to be able to start up a business, and one of the things I've always tried to do is get the business community more involved and active. One of the things we did about 20 years ago, we organized Principal for a Day, and we got 20 business leaders to go spend a day in different high schools throughout Bridgeport. And at the end of my day, they said, well, that's great. Would you like to make a contribution? I said, I'd like to do more than that. I'd like to teach. I'd like to help you teach. I'd like to be a volunteer teacher. And I helped take a class that was an accounting class, sort of dull, not that exciting for some of the young kids. They didn't quite understand why it was valuable to them. And I tried to bring it to life for these young people. And I got Joshua Grant from Soul to Soul Restaurant, who had started up a business, and gave these kids, a reason why what they were learning was important. And B, it's something I learned as much from as I think they did in terms of what a difference education can make, what I saw in those kids' eyes every day, and what I was able to do by bringing the community involved. Another reason I'm such a strong believer in strong community public schools. And I love being there at Harding High just a couple of months ago when they opened up the brand new school. And I saw the look in those kids' eyes, which is why I'm such a champion for education. It's the right thing to do for those kids, and it's the right thing to do for our state. And I finally graduated, as did those kids. I'm now a professor at Central Connecticut State University in New Britain, where, again, I bring in folks from the business community. They explain to these young people what it is to be a Travelers, what it is to be a Pratt & Whitney, and give these guys a role model and ideal that they can strive towards.
All right, thank you so much. Mr. Stefanowski, 90 seconds.
Thanks, Ann. Yeah, so I grew up in New Haven. I've always had an interest in the cities. I was on the board of the Cardinal Sheehan Center in Bridgeport. Terrific example of a private model to provide after-school programs, a nice facility to go to, sports activities, scholarships, just a great example of what we can do. I'll tell you the other thing, though, is I don't know how many of you have seen the commercial with my daughters. I'm pretty proud of those kids. Raising kids with the right values. My oldest daughter went to school in California. She's a social welfare major. Raising your kids so that they know they have to give back. Unfortunately, in this state, I got home the other night. I said, Lauren, you know, you've been home for a year now. It's been great having you, but it's time to fly the nest. And I said, what do you think you want to do? And she immediately says, I want to go back to California. She wants vibrant cities. She wants an opportunity to do social welfare where she can make enough money to live on her own. We have to create an environment for these kids that want to help improve our towns and cities and all the other things we desperately need to do in Connecticut. If we keep losing people by the day, we're losing 80 people a day. When I've been doing this tour across the state, there's a ton of good people out there. But they're frustrated. They want to help, but they need tax relief. They need jobs. They don't need another 4 years of Dan Malloy.
On the subject of your efforts to help the less fortunate members of society.
6 seconds to do that.
I'm sorry.
Do I have more
6
time?
seconds to answer his question.
Oh, I get a bonus. Yeah, again, Keith, I would go back to the Cardinal Sheehan Center, where I was on the board. I dedicated time and financially to that organization to help a lot of kids in Bridgeport and the surrounding towns get the proper training.
Thank you for that. Mr. Griebel.
I want to tie, Keith, your question back to Joe's. If we're not having a serious discussion about this $4.6 billion operating deficit, and we're not prepared to take the rainy day fund, we're going to undermine funding into special education. We're going to undermine funding to those agencies that take care of the most vulnerable. The most important thing a governor can do, and this is what I said earlier, Keith, what I've done is making sure we're having honest discussions about the issues, bringing the right people to the table to collaborate on them, and making sure that the dollars we use are being used in the right way. We have to have a serious discussion about the $4.6 billion operating deficit and how we're going to address it.
Gentlemen, make sure you stay on message.
Question
number 8, Daniela, to Mr. Lamont.
6 states have statutes, so-called death with dignity statutes on their books. Over the past 6 years, Connecticut's legislature has sponsored an assisted dying bill 5 times, but never once has it come up for a vote. If you were governor, would you sign legislation allowing people with less than 6 months to live to obtain a prescription from a doctor for a life-ending dose of medication?
I think I would, Daniela. Both my parents died in the last few years, and I just had a sense that they had their wits about them. I loved them to death. I was with them every chance I could, but I think they knew when they were ready to go. So it's an intensely personal decision that each and every family has to do, and I understand the legal safeguards that have to be in there, but at the end of the day, it's probably not a place where I want government intruding. I want that up to the families.
All right, thank you. Mr. Stefanowski, 90 seconds.
Yeah, it's a tough issue. I mean, I just went through it with my mom. My mom and dad were married together for 60 years. The last 2 years, she had dementia. And I talked to my dad about it, and he said, for better or for worse, I want your mother home. And unfortunately, with the cost of health care today, we burned through the entire life savings for $5,000 a week to have them at home. I would tend to leave it up to the family. I think it's a very personal decision that each family should make. I think my dad made the right decision because we were with my mom right up to the end when hospice came in, and we had some great lasting memories right towards the end. I would hope that no one would ever want to do that, but I'm not sure it should be legislated either.
All right, thank you. Mr. Griebel.
I don't have a fundamental disagreement with either Ned's or Bob's issues. I would want to understand the legal safeguards. I mean, there is always a concern about the slippery slope. So I think the idea of understanding more, Daniela, than I've had an in-depth conversation on. But the concept of letting individuals rather than government make decisions, I'm generally supportive of that concept.
All right, thank you. Mr. Lamont.
I just think it's a good discussion to be having here, because it tells you sort of a little bit about the role of government and sort of how we think about it and how we treat the family and how we treat individual rights. So I'm proud to be able to take that discussion a step further. I want to talk to folks from the religious community. I want to talk to folks in the faith community. I think there's a lot I can learn, but I think you know where my instincts are on this.
All right, thank you so much. Next question, Mr. DeLong, starting with Mr. Stefanowski.
Thank you, Ann. Earlier this evening, Mr. Stefanowski, you touched on unfunded mandates on municipal governments. To date, there are currently over 1,400 unfunded mandates on towns and cities. What I would like to know is, first off, would you support any new unfunded mandates for municipalities? And secondly, are there specific unfunded mandates that you would either be willing to eliminate or to fund?
Yeah, I thought it was 1,300. You actually got me with 1,400. I'll repeat what I said earlier. Most of the towns that I've seen traveling across the state are infinitely better managing their budget than the state of Connecticut is. Think about it. You have towns that are AAA rated in a state of Connecticut that's A rated. That's pretty darn good. We need to stay out of the way of the towns. I would veto any unfunded mandate that came to my desk going forward. I would ask that my different department heads to cull through that list of, I thought it was 1,300, 1,400, whatever the insane number is, and start to get rid of some of these unfunded mandates. You cannot start to solve the problems of Connecticut on the backs of the cities. What does Ned Lamont wants to do? He wants to put an auto tax on a statewide basis to put even more pressure on the cities. When I'm governor, we're going to fix what's going on in Hartford. We're going to cut costs up there. We're going to reduce taxes, which is going to get the property tax revenues in the different towns going up. And we're going to, quite honestly, we're going to stay out of their way. And the towns that are struggling, we're going to be all over it looking at how we can have more accountability and how we get out of the problems that some of these big cities are in.
All right, thank you so much. Mr. Griebel, 90 seconds.
Joe, I would certainly welcome the opportunity to sit down with you and your board to look at that list of unfunded mandates. The whole concept is disingenuous when the state tells a municipality it has to do X and then doesn't provide the funding or provide some aspect of how you're going to get that funding. It's disingenuous, and it's just a question of where we as taxpayers pay the taxes, either out of our left-hand pocket to the state or out of our right-hand pocket to the municipality. So the unfunded mandate may make people feel good in the capital because they've done something that they think is right, but then passing it on to the towns makes no sense. And I would say that also applies to a lot of our private sector companies that are concerned about the mandates or the regulations that inhibit their ability to deliver the service, keep the people employed that they have, make a fair profit on it, and continue to generate the economy. So these things, the idea of taking positions in Hartford and saying just because we think it's a great idea and we got enough votes to get it passed, and the governor doesn't veto it, is definitely in the wrong direction. So I'd welcome the opportunity, Joe, to sit down with you on those 13 or 1,400, take a look at which ones we could prioritize and get rid of. If they're ones that we think we need for safety, then let's have a discussion how we're going to fund it across the board and not simply transfer it to the municipality.
Mr. Lamont, 90 seconds.
Well, I'm one person up here who has been involved in local government as a selectman and member of the Board of Finance, and I also know this is where the rubber meets the road. That sometimes the federal government can push obligations on the states, then the states push the obligations on you, and you're the ones that have to figure out how to get it done. And you have to figure out how to get it done with finite resources. And so no, I'll give you a specific that I've been thinking about. It just seems to me, look, the state of Connecticut says you can't tax, many of your cities have the property, not-for-profit, government, et cetera. How about in the government buildings? If we're not going to pay our pilot, if we're not going to pay our fair share, that's an unfunded mandate on you. Maybe you should have an opportunity to figure out what we do there. Or as we've talked about, maybe the state should make sure those buildings get back onto the tax roll to bring down, to have them pay property tax as a private owner there. I think those are the type of things we've got to think about in terms of how we can bring down the cost. I see Mark Boughton here from Danbury, and other mayors have often talked about how we can create a service relationship with some of the not-for-profits as a way perhaps we can help bring down property tax in our cities. That's the number one thing I think is a priority for me, to bring down that property tax. And unfunded mandates is just one more way we shove the obligation on you. It's the wrong thing to do, and I'm going to change it.
Mr. Stefanowski, 30 seconds.
Yep. Ned mentioned a specific, the other specific, and don't forget it because it's on record. He's going to institute a statewide auto tax. So if Ned wins the governorship and you run your budgets, you better take that revenue stream out because it's gone, and you're never going to see it again. The best way to get this economy moving and to get property taxes up is to stimulate the economy. That's why I've been endorsed by the Association of Realtors. We need rising housing prices. We need lower taxes. We need to bring jobs back. I'm the only one up here with an economic plan to do it.
Thank you so much. Now, gentlemen, I have a question. We'll start with Mr. Griebel. 15 seconds each. Your favorite politician and why?
At any time in history?
Yes.
Abraham Lincoln, because of the leadership he provided on ending slavery and at the same time to try to keep the country united.
Mr. Lamont.
Bobby Kennedy. And let me just say that nonsense about the statewide property tax is just not true.
Stay on message, sir.
Not true.
On
not
message.
You had your chance, Ned.
Why do you prefer Bobby Kennedy?
Because he's fearless. He stood up and thought he did what he thought was right.
All
and
right,
he
thank
took
you.
whatever
Mr.
the consequences.
Stefanowski, your favorite politician and why?
I would say Ronald Reagan. He brought hope back to America. He fixed the economy. He got taxes down. We need to start feeling proud about Connecticut again. We need to start talking about what we can do, not what we can't do. We need to get this economy moving.
Thank you, gentlemen, for indulging me. All right. Now closing statements, 1 minute each. Mr. Griebel.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I hope all of you read the Hartford Courant endorsement of our candidacy and the call that the Courant made to really breaking the duopoly, bringing candid leadership, inclusive leadership that brings collaboration to the table. I hope you read that. I hope you listened to some of the conversations up here. I hope over the last couple of debates you've seen two people, Monty Frank and myself, who are prepared to provide leadership that's not focused on a party, which party's in charge, whether it says R or D on my sweatshirt, but rather a leadership team that's going to focus on you as the taxpayer, the resident, and the employer, and restore Connecticut to national preeminence. This is an aspirational ticket. And while the budget's important, it's about moving Connecticut back up to being a leader in employment and in all community development, all important quality of life issues. So on November 6th, vote the bottom line, vote line 1H, vote for Oz Griebel and Monty Frank.
Thank you so much. Mr. Lamont. 1 minute.
Look, we found out in the last week that these are serious times. You need a leader who sets the tone, who brings people together, and in a time of crisis, somebody who's going to get the job done. You have a real choice in this election coming up. You have somebody who's not providing a serious solution, who's talking about eliminating $10, $12 billion. You know who's going to pay. Each and every one of the folks in your towns is going to pay. Higher property taxes, cut in education. You're going to need somebody who's going to stand up and fight for Obamacare and fight for the protections we need. Wherever I go, people tell me about pre-existing conditions, their dad with diabetes, and what are we going to do? I promise you, as governor, we're going to make sure those people are protected. You need somebody who knows how to start a business and create jobs. Bob has just done just the opposite. He's let businesses go under, and I'm not going to let that happen. I helped bring a major business to Hartford called Infosys. I'm going to do everything I can to make you believe in the state, get this state going again, get this state growing again.
Thank you so much.
And I will hope to earn your trust and your vote.
Mr. Stefanowski, 60 seconds.
Thank you, Ann. You know, Ned likes to say to fix Connecticut, everybody needs to do a little bit more. That's code word for taxes. And you know what? The families of Connecticut have done enough already. We've had 8 years of this insanity. It's time for a change. So here's what we're going to do together. We're going to rip the Band-Aid off in Hartford. We're going to cut the size of government. We're going to eliminate wasteful spending. We're going to reduce our taxes and get jobs and businesses to come back here. We're going to grow our economy to invest more in education and health care and all the things we need. We're going to bring our families home. Now, if you've been able to survive the last 8 years under Dan Malloy, please don't give up now. Help is on the way, and it starts next Tuesday. I've been turning around failing businesses for 30 years. I can turn around the state of Connecticut and bring hope and pride back to this state. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Gentlemen, thank you so much for taking part tonight. We have special debate coverage on Channel 9 right now with the Capitol Team Report. Election Day, as you said, is next Tuesday. Get out and vote. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thanks, Ian.
Good job, Ned. Okay.
Thanks.